Now you hear it.
When you're a child, you learn there are 3 dimensions: height, width, and depth, like a shoebox. Then later you hear there's a 4th dimension: time.
From Seattle, we're Drinking the Movies. I'm Taylor Baker.
And I'm Michael Clawson.
All right, Michael, we're back in the studio after a much-deserved break for you on the Isle of Hawaii. Any major life changes at all?
This is true. I did have a brief vacation in Hawaii for the purpose of a honeymoon. I did get married. If there are any changes in my attitudes, opinions, perhaps that could be attributed to my marital status, but I'm guessing after dating my now wife for over 8.5 years, being 3 weeks into marriage, probably not going to be too many changes.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident there's going to be little changes, and if there are, I will have no problem berating you for them.
Most definitely. Call me out.
Today, we are rescreening a film from Max Ophüls, a refugee of Hitler's takeover of Europe. And the film is Letter from an Unknown Woman, which is originally based on a novella written by Stefan Zweig, who was also displaced by the Nazi occupation of Europe. Any first reactions, thoughts to either the novella, which I happily convinced you to read, or the film, which I happily convinced you to watch?
I adored both the novella and the movie. I am a big fan of this one. Very happy you suggested it, and I understand you have a strong affection for both as well. Yes,
I love this film, and I have a very long history with Stefan Zweig, not just this book or novella, but many of his stories, and him as a creative and artist who was amongst a certain group of people that vanished, kind of like the Austria that we see within the film. This is hearkening back to something that no longer exists and will never exist again. And there's kind of a lovelorn, love lost to it that I think is particularly heartachingly gorgeous.
Lots of heartbreak in this text, for sure.
By the time you read this letter, I may be dead. I have so much to tell you, and perhaps very little time. Will I ever send it? I don't know. I must find the strength to write now before it's too late. And as I write, it may become clear that what happened to us had its own reason beyond our poor understanding. If this reaches you, you will know how I became yours when you didn't know who I was.
Letter from an Unknown Woman, originally published, I believe, in 1921 as a novella by Stefan Zweig in Vienna. Later adapted in 1948 to film by Max Ophüls, one of Stanley Kubrick's considered greatest filmmakers of all time.
I think Andrew Sarris is one critic who's also heaped acclaim on Ophüls, I think among many, many others. You want to start personal? I'm curious just to know how long ago it was that you read the novella, because this is one that I've heard you mention many, many times as one you really, really adore.
Yes. So I first read this novella when I was 15 or 16. It was directly after I'd read Hermann Hesse's Demian, which is equally kind of deeply personal, moving work that has metatextual symbolism inside of it and the author's own personal issues inside of it as well. We just talked about Death in Venice from Thomas Mann. You know, these are all, contemporaries of the Austro-Hungarian great works of literature at that time that really influenced me as a teenager, I guess. The love story here is fascinating because it is complete ownership for suffering and masochism and delights and relishes in it, but is like wholly responsible for it too. There's no accusation, there's no accusatorial behavior in it. And a lot of the criticism of the novel and the film, especially the film that I've come across, is missing that point, and they're trying to make a claim that like that she is a victim and that he is a perpetrator, kind of, because he's aloof and he's pursuing his own life's objectives, which, while you may disagree with, he undoubtedly is enjoying himself. And so, yeah, it's one of those deep, rich works that the more I look at, the more I appreciate. I recently reread it in preparation for this, and just like I did the first time I read it, the end made me cry.
There you go. Gets the emotions flowing.
Gets the waterworks every time.
I can completely understand that. Yeah, I had not seen this film until you suggested it for discussion. And I read the novella in preparation for it, which I very much enjoyed. It was odd to read something so heartbreaking while sitting next to the pool in Maui. That did not feel like...
On your honeymoon?
It did not feel like the right setting. Exactly.
That's what I was thinking as well, but I was like, if he's going to read it, he's going to read it.
But take it. It's fabulous, no doubt. And I adore this movie and some of the other Ophüls movies that I watched in tandem with it in the last couple weeks or so. As we were chatting last night, I know you also caught, right? The other Ophüls film.
That's correct.
Caught.
I'm simultaneously trying to pull up my Max Ophüls list so that I know which ones I watched. So Caught is my favorite other American film that I watched from him. I'm not certain about this, but I'm pretty sure that the staircase of the mansion in Caught is the same exact staircase of the theater here in Letter from an Unknown Woman, which is just like a fascinating thing to observe, like the recycling of like one is like a personal house and one is a public house, and just how Ophüls perhaps had his favorite things to go to here in America. This is also... Letter from an Unknown Woman is also his first film as an American, if I remember correctly. He immigrated in 1941 and then went 7 years without making a film. But yes, I caught, and it's a delightful film. She also, at one point, which happens in Letter from an Unknown Woman, the film, is a clothing model. So she's a shop girl, quote unquote, where women come in and they want to see clothes modeled, and you walk around, and there's just a lot of repetition to what he was doing here in America. And I only caught one of his European films, which you did as well, and I did not respond very well to it at all, and I know you did. That's La Ronde.
Oh, interesting. Just didn't do much for you?
I was entirely mixed on it. I do not dislike it. There's a lot of things that I think are ingenious with the camera, but the narrative composition, and I just did not find myself gripped by it at any point. It's one of those things where it's like, this is a master with a camera, but I don't care about the story.
That is easily, I think, his like more playful of the movies I've seen, right? Like considerably lighter in tone than...
Yes. But each of these is very mature, very adult. It handles, I believe, just in general, he handles sexuality in a very, what I would call, French way, even though he's Austrian. Like, he is not shirking away from the fact that people have sex and expressing themselves as adults and making adult choices with their sexuality. And I just found that fascinating, especially at this point in time.
Oh, yeah, especially in La Ronde. Those characters have sexual appetites. That is like the movie.
But that's European cinema, so I mean he's getting away with a lot more there. But I mean even his American films, like, there's something like the Reckless Moment. Yeah, the Reckless Moment, where the entire film is predicated on a murder that isn't really a murder. It's an accidental murder from a daughter who's been sleeping with an older man, and then the mother finds out that she accidentally killed the man, and then the mother covers it up and tries to keep the daughter from ever finding out. It's fascinating.
Interesting. That's cool.
Because it's like, it's contemporary at that point in time, Hollywood cinema and the entire premise is like your adulterous daughter and you're trying to cover up her murder. Like, it's just fun.
Yeah,
it's almost Hitchcock.
the difference between the risque elements of some of the French films and what seems to have been subjected to the censors in Letter from an Unknown Woman is kind of striking. This is a relatively tame film in a sexual way, even in comparison to the text, like the Stefan Zweig text for sure.
Yeah, very much so. She's saying like how much pleasure she's getting from the agony of wanting him and not having him, and that is, they never go into the fact that she's getting self-gratification from masochism, essentially. Like, they never actually dig into that. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I could imagine a really cynical critic out there calling it a kind of misery porn, which I would never call it, but I could see that as a plausible response. Yeah. More the text than the movie.
A plausible, unreasonable response.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We want to talk about the narrative a little bit, using maybe the film as like our grounding point, since they are different in some pretty significant ways, and then as needed, talk about where they diverge. Yeah,
I don't know how interesting it's going to be, but it's kind of hard for me to not talk about it without the text. I don't know for you if it's easy or not, but so the beginning, and we're already differing from the narrative itself, is he's coming home. Stefan is coming home from being out with his friends, and in the morning he has to catch a murder. He has to catch a duel. He has to fight someone to the death. And this is the framing device of the narrative. This is also the end of the film, is the resumption of this duel that has to occur. And this duel is with a man who marries our central figure, played by Joan Fontaine, who has a name which she should not have, but whatever. And her name is Lisa within this film. So Lisa's husband is aware that she was in love with him, and from what I gathered with the way that the narrative is presented, we just have to kind of talk backwards and forwards because of how the letter is delivered at the end of life and she's dead.
Yeah.
But he doesn't know that, apparently, because the last name that she says is not his name, but rather Stefan's name. So the letter goes to Stefan, and he doesn't know that his wife is dead, and he, I gather, thinks his wife is in the arms of Stefan. So that's the framing device of the film, and then a letter is delivered because she says with her last breath Stefan's name, and they go, we proceed to go up the stairwell that we will get to know very well, and Stefan reading a letter from an unknown woman, and a beautiful, gauzy mirage, spiral pirouetting camera work with smoke and effect allures us into a narrative story that is presented entirely by Lisa. There's many film critics. We've talked about film spotting a lot, Josh Larson among them, who, and I think Adam even agreed with him, who thought that this film was Stefan's imagining of the narrative. But if you watch the film, it's very clear that he almost always has a shadow on his face, and she's always lit up. And like it's just so clear that this is her telling her story, which is exactly what the narrative is, and that he's just a side character in this girl pursuing the ideal of lust and longing, and that he really has nothing to do with it. She's not even in love with him, she's in love with the ideal of him. And it's so fascinating to me that so many people that I like have gotten this so wrong to think that this is about him and not about her.
Yeah, I think, to think that the movie is more interested in his perspective than hers seems off to me, for sure. There are little moments that are, I mean, I guess you could call them little inconsistencies, where we're within that kind of the inner narrative, not the framing device, where we're seeing Stefan with a character other than Lisa, Joan Fontaine's character in the movie, and she's not present, which makes you think, are we then hearing this from his perspective? Like, there's a moment.
Or are we with her imagining all those women that were with him?
That's true, but there's like the moment where he goes to I think it's at the restaurant or the hotel, and he briefly talks to the restaurateur about, he's asking the restaurateur to please tell his other women to not bother him tonight or something like that, because he's got someone he's already with, which honestly read more just like a little inconsistency than something that truly suggests to me we're seeing this through his eyes. I very much think our perspective is that of Lisa's, as so long as we're in the internet narrative.
Yeah, but that's to me where the masochism comes in, just a little bit, because the entire, like, if you go look, she's lit up with a halo light, like, the entire time. Like, everything is about how she's entering the frame. Everything about him is how he's engaging with her. And even that little thing that you're bringing up is about how he has to hold back the tides of women because of her, you know. And it's all, you know, this self-centered ego-ness that I love narratively. Like, I think it's amazing because it is deeply personal, and it's unfamiliar but true.
Yeah. This idea about masochism and the text, Stefan Zweig's text, suggesting that Lisa, or the unknown woman, takes some pleasure in denying herself something. Yeah, I don't know that entirely comes through for me in the movie. To me, the essence of the heartbreak in the movie, and the text to some extent, this is all a little fuzzy, but it's just the idea that, like, one of the things that's even worse than not being loved back by someone you are in love with, someone you completely adore or idolize or are utterly infatuated with, is realizing that you might have made no impression on them at all. That to them, you are forgettable. Like, that is so much worse than them just saying, I'm not interested, or I don't want you anymore. And how crushing that is to your sense of your own value, how interesting you are. I'd have to, you're talking about the masochism in the text. I think I'd maybe have to keep that at the front of my mind if I were to watch the movie again and see, where do I see her taking pleasure in this on screen?
Right. So there's a duality here. There's a bicameralism where she's simultaneously protecting herself from she's trying to protect herself, perhaps subconsciously, from ever truly being rejected by never truly pursuing her dream. Right. It's just like everybody who says this is my dream to do it and then does nothing about it. You're protecting yourself from failing. So she's kind of protecting herself from failing while she's simultaneously longing. And then when she has these moments where she's very meek and she's very happy, you know, for these moments that happen when she's 20, and you know, less happy when she's 30, obviously, because she leaves. There's a duality at play where she doesn't really want to spoil the ideal, and I have to say this again, it's up to you and your interpretation, but especially in the film, she's not in love with the man, Stefan. She's in love with the ideal that he represents. And it's a cultured ideal. It's an idea of an adult man that is artistic and profound and masterful and genius, and finds her equally beautiful and worthy of doting upon because he's a man of such stature, which by him doting on her, that elevates her own importance. And that's another thing that that Max Ophüls gets at in the film Caught. It's literally a woman between two men, and figuring out that the richer one that's more cultured is not the one that she likes so much as the doctor who actually sees her as a person. This is an idea that, is central to a lot of narratives. But I don't see how you could not see that. At least I don't see how you could disagree with that when it's put out in front of you.
That being that she is attracted to the ideal of him versus the man himself. This is
once again the Death in Venice problem. This is the problem with Austro-Hungarian writers in contemporary life, I guess, is like they're writing about symbolism. They're writing about ideal. They're writing about deeper things, and then they're marrying those into people. So they're making an ideal into a person, and that's how they achieve great narrative strength. And it's, I think, hard to for people unfamiliar or people that disagree to come to terms with that.
Yeah, and I think that's much more evident in the novella than the film for me, which suggests to me she very much would spend her life with Stefan if he remembered her and if he was genuinely curious about her in the same way that she is about him.
How confident are you that it would last?
Well, we don't know. We don't have enough of a sense of whether or not he'd make a good husband. So I think it's more. I think the movie suggests it's a little more on him, that this is not manifesting than her. I don't know that I see the film language telling me that it wouldn't last because she wants the ideal of him and not the man himself, if that makes sense. I actually think the book, there are some really interesting lines when the two of them go to the park, and he says something like, "I like coming here in the winter and I don't know why." And she says, "Well, it's because you get to imagine what it would be like in the spring. You get to imagine what it was like. You like not quite knowing. You like the picturing of it." And then there are the comments about the mountaintops because he's a mountain climber. And he says, "I actually always just like imagining that there's one bigger mountain." So, you could argue that what she is describing is actually something more like herself, where she likes the idea of him rather than him himself, in the same way that he likes to imagine spring in the park. But I actually think, and I think that kind of works if you're talking about the text, Stefan Zweig, but I think the film's perspective is that that's kind of the problem between them, is that is a good description of him. He likes the mystery about her, and she says that verbatim at one point. You love mystery. He is attracted to the fact that he doesn't know very much about her. She, on the other hand, has this intense curiosity about who he is. She has this fascination with the objects that are going into his house. She wants to learn about the music he plays. She wants to dance to be familiar with his world. And so there's this incompatibility in that she has this intense curiosity to want to know him, to want to understand him, to want to know him, and he likes that unknown, and that's the problem, because it generates his forgetfulness, his vague, foggy memory, which I think is it's almost like the reverse of what we're talking about in the text itself, which is about her wanting an ideal, wanting something that she'll never quite know, if that makes sense.
So I see how you're getting there. My read of like the opening of the film when she's a little girl and she is leaning into a moving carriage and she's observing a harp, that to me isn't her wanting to get to know him. That's her falling in love with the ideal. Like that, she's falling in love with objects. She's falling in love with a silhouette in a window while she's on a swing. She's falling in love with the sounds that this person makes and his reputation before she ever sees him. Right? This is pedestalizing. This is it's not quite worship, but it's girlish delight and adoration and almost hero worship rather than romantic love at first, right? And maybe it does evolve to something more mature toward a romantic love, but still foundationally there is a girl who was fascinated and began this type of hero worship love thing. And from the start, she was not saying it openly. It was not even true to her closest family members, like her mother or her mother's husband. Like, this is a very private thing. And it seems like she's not letting herself get hurt by a person who is more than a person. They're an idea. And that idea isn't just an idea that she has. That's an idea she has about herself. And as soon as she loses that, then she'll lose the idea that she has about herself. And that's where the magic is, because it's not so much a fear of him, it's a fear of what he changes about who she sees herself to be.
I see that more. I completely see that in the text more so than the film, where I feel like she has this desire to satisfy the curiosity she has about him.
There's weird things in the movie, right? There's so in the novel, she literally just runs across the room to see him at the ball near the end. What is it? In the film, I think Mozart's The Magic Flute is on in the theater, and then so in the film she like leaves and she's pacing behind pillars and mulling things over. This is also something he repeats in Caught in a Garage, where Ophüls is here creating a philosophical dilemma for her, whereas in the novel she is taken completely by her emotionality and overtly embarrasses her husband.
Yeah. I think Ophüls opts for the more audience-friendly version of this story, where
like commonplace.
Yeah, where Lisa is struggling to continue to pursue this after a certain point, after she sees that she has proved to have been forgettable to him, and it's almost like this selfless kind of gesture she makes by not wanting to bring her child into his world. She said she didn't want to burden him. It's a very selfless kind of devotion.
Are we talking about the novel or the film?
I think that's kind of true in both, actually. The selflessness aspect of her love.
It's more selfish, right? She gets her own him in the novel. That she expresses that a little bit more of like satisfied greed of like, now I had a part of you.
Yeah, I think the movie pitches her decision to not share the information about them having a child with him as a selfless act. I think she literally said that in the narration, right? So that I didn't want to burden you with this, I guess.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I mean, one of the best movies with narration.
Oh, 100%. Like, you can't really do it without narration. And I think just in general, it's an interesting adaptation because it's such a short movie. It's under 90 minutes. I think it flies by. I think it's a very fast-paced movie. The original text is already quite short, and there's a lot that it kind of cuts out. So it feels very concise, but I don't feel like it sacrifices depth or feeling. It achieves a lot with quite little and a very rather simple premise. Pretty effective use of both the narration and the framing device. I think that all worked quite fantastically.
Right, and I think the reason for that is the craft work happening on the back end. It's these gauzy, beautiful looking interiors. It's the exteriors where there's somehow always a halo light on Joan Fontaine's face, and every other character, is seemingly underlit. And then you've got these things happening in the background that just really establish the place. At one point, there's the street lighter, who at that point in time was literally like, I believe he was just part of the meritocracy, probably very low on the totem pole, and they would just walk around with a fire pole, and they would have a hook on it at the end, and they would open the street lamp, and they would put the fire on the other side of that end and light it, and then they would close it. And just seeing that stuff happen in the background really actually grounds the place and the time in a way that a lot of these other films that I've seen from this period just do not do that.
Completely. I think it's a very rich film for how it handles characters, just like the one you mentioned. Some of these little supporting characters who only have a few seconds of screen time, or maybe more, like the case of Stefan's servant, who's mute here, but not mute in Stefan Zweig's text, if I remember right. But he also, Ophüls just like takes a couple seconds to just kind of pause on these other little side characters who are involved or this and that, like the operators of the amusement park ride. There's no real need for us to kind of like just pause and hold on the image of the guy who kind of cranks the different backgrounds of the train as they quote unquote, traveled the world. There are, the musicians when Stefan and Lisa go dancing one evening late into the night, and the musicians are kind of complaining about how late it is and how they want to go home. There's some really, and on that note, there's some great little touches of relief, because this is a very, it's a movie with a lot of heartbreak. Those little touches of relief, I think, go a long way without being corny. Those are quite welcome, in my opinion.
I completely agree. There's also, I can't remember because of the way this is cut, if there's a separate ballroom in the same park where they get on the train, or if it's like a ballroom attached to that same area. But there's a whole kind of mini orchestra playing for them. And at one point, there's a back and forth between like the orchestra leader and like first chair or whatever instrument, saying, I don't like playing for these people. They're not married. It's what they're doing is improper. I like playing for people that are married that can go home and do something about it. And it's just like, you can't tell if that's commentary that like they wanted in there, or if that's commentary that they put in for like the MPAA. Like what exactly am I hearing here? It's like, it's a great way of handling it either way. It's one of those fascinating bits of dialogue that's like, this thing is not like the other things.
Yeah, it's this a funny kind of echo with some scenes in The Earrings of Madame Duh, where the heroine and her lover in that movie dance night after night after night, and there's kind of this long montage of them dancing repeatedly, and there's the exact same kind of thing where the musicians say a very similar kind of the remark. They're like, go home already, which is just funny because it's this very clear echo, but also the idea that when you're in love, when you're in the throes of passion, you can outlast everybody. You can just keep going. You get lost in time. It's a nice little idea. There's also, on the note of comedic relief, the very first scene within the inner narrative where Stefan's moving in and we see all these musicians being carried up, and one of the movers is like, why couldn't you have played the piccolo instead of the piano? Not like a laugh out loud moment, but still a genuinely funny kind of comment. That the piccolo of all things is just a nice little touch.
Yeah, no, that is. I love that sequence, right? Because it starts with her leaning into from the outside, trying to reach in, which is exactly just what the entire film is. How about Joan Fontaine for you? 12, 20, 30. Did she work? Did she not work?
Oh, you mean those are ages you're throwing out? Oh, the
film starts when she's 12. Then she hooks up with Stefan, and that's how they have a child at 20, and then at the end of the film, 30.
The age thing is very interesting here. I think she is great, and so much of it has to do with like all this that she's kind of withholding because she's trying to kind of put on a brave face. She doesn't really want to break down in front of Stefan, but she looks so giddy with excitement when they're enjoying their moments of happiness, and then when she is almost on the verge of telling him who she is and the fact that he's forgotten, like you can just you feel how much she is concealing it. All that withheld emotion, I think, is really great. What about you before I keep talking?
I mean, I think she works flawlessly with Ophüls to make the camera itself elicit the idea of like the actual idea of her internal monologue happening. Even when she's not narrating, it feels like you can feel her. Like I don't like the choice to have a philosophical debate rather than have a emotional upheaval in the ball. But I mean, he still handles that flawlessly when she's pacing back and forth behind the pillars, and the camera is tracing in this really weird way back and forth handheld cinematography. That I can't explain like exactly what it's doing or like how it's in sync, but you get this, you begin to deliberately sense exactly what she is deliberating on, and isn't correct to compare these two films, but there's something magical that happens in Uncut Gems 2 where the camera is informing how stressed out you're getting.
Yeah.
And it's reflective of how stressed out Adam Sandler's character is.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something interesting there where there's really great filmmakers that I seem to respond to like with my body rather than my head, like this film, is they're making me feel something with their camera that I can't really explain how they did.
Yeah. There's some pretty elaborate shots in this movie. So many in that stairwell where Lisa lives as a teenager with Stefan. There's just like a lot of kind of verticality to those shots when she's at the top of the staircase and looking down or reverse. And to kind of tie that back to what we were just talking about with her age, I think this is interesting in how it's kind of like delicate about the age difference, whereas I think the text is a little more frank about her being considerably younger than him. But I think Ophüls kind of like hints at it in some visual ways, when that's usually because she seems to like literally be looking up at him, like when he's playing at the piano and she's kneeling, she looks like a little girl there.
I mean, when she's on the swing,
he puts the bib on her when they're going out to dinner, right? The lobster bib. But it's clearly defending itself a little bit too from what might gross out an audience of. Well,
there's no sexuality when they're 12. When she's 12.
Right, and she doesn't even look 12 to me at that point, which I think helps.
No, but she does look younger than she looks later.
For sure.
It's very interesting like how they pull that off, and there's a lot of like the camera being really far away from her, or like shrinking her with some like larger objects or larger men around her. Her standing behind a door, like there's just things that kind of don't necessarily say I'm young, but say like I'm diminutive in the visual language that I think is really interesting choice-wise.
Yeah, which I think is a really cool way for the movie or Ophüls to sort of respect that element of Zweig's text without making it too front and center, that it's this like May-December relationship, because otherwise that could too easily become the point, which I don't know that it really is the point, that there's an age difference.
Yes. I'm glad this isn't going Death in Venice.
Right. That can be just distracting.
But I mean, it does underline my point earlier, which is like, this is a girlish infatuation. This is like close to hero worship.
Yeah.
And this is like, a boy crush thing where she just never got over it. And, there's tons of girls all over the country now that, had this for Justin Bieber or whoever the hot new heartthrob is, Robert Pattinson, etc. And then, life goes on and they grow out of it. But this is like a more intimate, this is my personal, celebrity boy crush type of a thing.
Yeah. I was very struck by the prevalence of music just everywhere in this movie. Not just the fact that Stefan is the concert pianist, but there's all this like diegetic music too. Like when she goes to Lynn's and she's having her little dates with the guy who wants to marry her, as the band is kind of marching around the Lynn's like courtyard. When she first meets Stefan, there's a little group of street singers nearby. Which again just gives this really kind of makes for a very aesthetically rich kind of film experience when there's so much music and so much of it is really beautiful. And the score itself, I don't know about you, but with old Hollywood movies, sometimes the scores just don't leave an impression because they're always orchestras. Some are more distinctive than others. There's a melody though that's in this score that is just so bittersweet and it's so beautiful. It's good stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's so many different simultaneously things, right? There's Ophüls' own reverence for Stefan Zweig, and then I forget the screenwriter's name, Zorn maybe was the last name, who adapted it, right? But then there's also Ophüls now post World War II, like trying to harken back and like conjure up this ideal of Austria and like You know, even though there's this love-lorn, love-sick narrative happening that is this Hollywood melodrama, in a way, there's also, like you said, these diegetic streets that are come to life with this beautiful art and these people that are living life. And, you know, they might be working one day, but then the next day they're escorting their 12-year-old daughter around the streets of Linz, dressed up fancy and like living life and in a really like gorgeous, gaudy, without being like overly focused on wealth way in the film. You know, like it's this great remembrance that I think is deeply personal in how it's expressing Austria, which is maybe why it's so good. And then the quality of the text inside of all these emotions that are pouring out of a 7-year hiatus filmmaker who, you know, is, after this film, someone who's close to the word master. Yeah,
you're talking about recreating Vienna and just the sense of place. Like, there's always just a lot to look at. Even in the first half, I feel like the second half is striking because she has married wealthy, and she is immediately wearing like that big white fur coat that's just like beautiful. Her house is, you know, luxurious with the furniture and the clothes and the candles and all that ornate detail. But even in the first half, when she's relatively poor, there's that scene where she's doing the rug beating with all of her neighbors at the complex. They all bring their rugs out and hang them over like branches and stuff to beat them. And that shot is like narratively kind of incidental until they get up to the apartment. But there's just so much going on in that shot, like in terms of the visual depth of it. You see everyone in that shot. It's a really clear image. There's just it's like a really active frame. I just feel like there's formally a lot alive in this movie. It's so good.
Right. And then there's the snowy corridor tea where Joan Fontaine is standing there in her black coat, you know, hugging her arms with her back to the wall, you know, just waiting for Stefan to sidle up. And you're just kind of lingering there. There's some kids down the way. Some people walk past and then turn and then walk and grab a snowball. And it almost looks like they're looking directly at the camera. And they take their hat off and they put it back. And there's just this richness, this aliveness that makes you wonder about like these different people, even though they never said a word. And even though you were always focused on Joan, you saw these other things out of the, you know, while you were focused on her.
And you already brought it up, but just to bring it up again because it's so good, you brought up the very first kind of blurry dissolve we get when we're going from the framing device and into the kind of inner narrative. And there are so many like dissolves like that are just so beautiful. I think they're better aesthetically than they are like in concept, because the concept's like kind of straightforward, right? It's kind of about your memory being blurry, which almost sounds like it's such a simple explanation for something that on screen is so beautiful. It looks so good.
Right. Interesting. So I don't know that I'd say blurry, right? Because it's not even his memory. It's her memory, but she's also, you know, number one, when we remember things, we're remembering how we want to, and then when she's putting it to paper, she's even taking that next step of, you know, telling it in a way that you want. And you know, to me, it's gauzy. There's this extra level of cotton balls and, you know, beautiful lighting and exacerbated shadows and gorgeousness that underlines what is ultimately like a terribly sad story about a woman never having requited love, losing her child. And the greatest point perhaps of Max Ophüls that I've come across is she marries for wealth and is ultimately in every way unhappy.
Pretty much. Which do you feel like this movie, in coming back to where it began with Stefan ultimately deciding to participate in the duel and the next morning, is it looking for some happiness in this ending that it might not otherwise have by giving him an opportunity to redeem himself? That was kind of what I felt was a very much a movie and studio kind of thing versus how the original text obviously ends. And in a little bit of a false way. It doesn't really bother me very much, but I kind of feel like, what good is redemption when she's already dead? It doesn't do anybody any good. But I do think it's maybe an effort to bring some brightness to this otherwise quite heartbreaking story.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, I would imagine Altman doing, where Altman's like, no, studio, I'll totally do this, but then like has a totally different objective than the objective that you just laid out. And that being like, not only does he now know that like she died and was in love with him, like he's got a pointless reason that he's gonna go die. Number one, Number two, he has to go tell her husband that she's dead. Mm-hmm. Or number three, he has to go kill the woman who loved him that he didn't even know, his husband, after his child died. Like either, like no matter what, like it just underlines what's already tragic. But I could totally see the studio being like, now this is a moral narrative that we can get behind.
Right. You know? He's found his errors. He's redeeming himself partially.
But really, Max Ophüls is like, and now he has to like go like commit even more agony. Yeah.
And that kind of echoes the end of the end of the Earrings of Madame Duh, which ends with this with a duel as well. I could imagine him being like, "Oh yeah, I've done that. Let's do the duel thing."
Yeah, that's the one that I really wanted to get to that I just didn't line
time.
Up.
Yeah,
and about timing, you know, we had a little bit longer of a lead on this one, and I was like, I don't want to watch it too soon because then I'm gonna forget. And then time compiled up with VIF and Fantastic Fest here and TIFF and all sorts of stuff, and I just ended up not having time for another foreign language film.
Yeah. Louis Jordan as Stefan, were you a fan?
Fantastic.
He's good. He's real good.
He's so convincing, and as he ages, it's just pulled off perfectly, just like Joan. You can't really put your finger on it entirely until the very end when his hair is literally a different shade. But I mean, up until then, like he's just slowly developing and changing in really convincing ways that are not overt. I wouldn't quite say subtle, but you know, somewhere in there where he's changing and adapting and aging almost naturally, and that's just so hard to pull off. I can't figure out exactly how they did that so well.
Yeah, and I think that makes this story a particularly unique one, is how genuine his fascination with her so often seems when she's talking and he's listening. He seems to be listening so intently, and he really holds his eye contact with her. And so that this is a story in which he has this real fascination with her, has these lovely moments, and then just plain kind of forgets about her. It's so different from heartbreaking romances where it's usually a death. One member of the couple dies, they fight, something breaks them apart. She's obsessed with him. He's pretty fascinated with her, and then he forgets. And it's just like, it's a really different kind of way for this relationship to not work out.
Right, but
because he's not cruel, I guess is what I should say. He is passive in his in the way he hurts her. You know, he does not come across as outwardly hurtful.
I completely agree, and this is not really addressed within the film. But in the text, I mean, she becomes a woman of the night for a long period of time.
Right.
And tons of guys fall in love with her. And she just throws them to the side. And it's like, if you really want to, like, pick who's a villain in this narrative, like, it would definitely be her, because she's getting all these men to fall in love with her so that she can provide for her son and herself up until the point where she gets going steady with someone. And he is totally unknowingly hurting people, but she's actively kind of partaking in something that is hurtful. And it's just, I find it unfortunate that the film didn't go there. I still think the film is close to perfect. But it's just one of those little tiny notes that really changes how it plays as a film versus how the narrative plays. Because I think there's a couple words said, maybe where he says, you know, I'm surprised you could book me in like so soon or whatever. And you know, there's a little homage to like him thinking that she is a whore.
Right.
In that way. And maybe he's looking at that person who he knows and knows that, like many society men of that aristocracy, that, you know, that's probably just a paid woman on his arm, and he decides that he fancies her and tries to get her to come with him, which is what happens in the novella itself. And there's room for that to be what's happening on screen, but it is the opposite of overt. You really have to like overthink it.
Yeah, I mean that's like one of the biggest deviations, for sure. And it's interesting that like not only does she not become a prostitute in the film, but when we go
overtly,
right? Well, when she goes to the dress shop, and one of the first things she says about her getting the job at the dress shop is that the girls learned many things there.
Yes.
And we see one of the customers asking her boss a little question that he doesn't quite finish, but he's clearly, you know, inquiring about her perhaps availability for the evening or something like that. And she says, no, she's not like the other girls. So that the movie goes out of its way to not only not include the prostitution of the text, but also indicate that she is not doing that. It's like an overcorrection, which is kind of interesting.
Well, at that point in time, she wasn't, right? Within the novella. That's right when she moves to Linz. Right?
Yeah, you're right. I guess.
No, she moves from Linz back to Vienna. I don't think she started immediately. It was after she had a baby with Stefan that she began, if I remember correctly. But what's interesting is in Caught, the same thing happens. She's working in the shop. She's showing these clothes. A man who represents a wealthy man shows up with a card and wants her to come to this yacht party. She's, you know, vehement. I don't do that. I'm not that type of girl. And then her friend who she lives with in a flop house that's like straight out of, gosh, what were those fantastic movies that we watched from the 30s and 40s? Preston Sturges. Like she lives in like a Preston Sturges flop house with this other girl, you know. And she's trying to convince this girl to go for it because what else are you going to do with your life besides get married to a wealthy man? And that's that's this thing that's, I think, really at the heart of Ophüls is, you know, if a woman wants to get married, she should never get married for money. Like, I think he's actually very vehement in that. In all the films I've seen, like, the only relationships he ever respects on screen are ones of love, right? Like there's even an old couple in this film that just is super brief where she's leaving the clothing shop and this old woman is met by this older man and they walk home, or they seem to be walking home, and there's just like this gorgeous note that is passive there about like how beautiful you know, mutual relationships are, that isn't a woman marrying for money or a man marrying for status or whatever, like where it's just two people actually in love instead of seeing a false value there. And that's ultimately perhaps what Letter of an Unknown Woman and this rendition is about, is this false value that is placed above all others, this idealism.
Yeah. Sort of taking that but running a slightly different direction. I do think the marriage, her getting married, introduces like some totally different concepts I don't even really feel like are in the text at all about honor, and that seems like that's entirely the movie's own kind of idea that it's messing with, because that's one of the first things we hear from Stefan at the beginning of the film, is that he is planning to do the dishonorable thing and skip out on this duel, and then she is faced with this choice where her husband suggests there is such a thing as honor. The honorable thing to do here is stay here with me, your son, your family. That is the honorable thing. And this kind of question of like what's selfish and what's not. I mean, arguably, she has acted selflessly with regard to her relationship to Stefan her whole life. And this is the one time she's going to try this for herself when she does leave her husband and see if Stefan might respond. So yeah, these questions of honor, selfishness versus selflessness, I think are all kind of interesting and kind of tangled in a good way.
Yeah, they're very tangled. right? Because like there is that honor thing, but then there's her just wanting her own version of gratification, and then choosing that like she doesn't want to have it be false, right? Like that's really what she's getting at. It's not that she's protecting him in that moment entirely. It's that she doesn't want to admit it out loud in a lot of ways, and be alone with herself truly, because this is one of those things where once you say it, you can never take it back, and she chooses not to. There's a lot there. I think we're coming to the end, so I'll talk about one of the most heartbreaking things in the novella and ask you if you think they handled it well in the film, White Roses. How do you think they handled it within the film? Did it work for you in the novella? Does it lose some of its energy here? Are you okay with how it was played?
It doesn't not work in the movie, but it loses a lot of its significance relative to the written text, where it's a really kind of beautiful and important strand of their relationship. I don't think we get anything in the movie about her sending these roses to him every year on his birthday, right? We just see them on the table, and it's kind of a tip
and he
to
gets
the text, but
he gets one single white rose for her on the carriage.
Yeah, so I'll say that I didn't dislike what it did with the white roses, but I did kind of miss that element from the written text because I think it's very nicely handled there.
Right, and but the anecdote in the written text is like the next day is his birthday, and she's asking him to go get them for her. Like, do this for me. I've never asked you to do anything for me before, but the one thing I want you to do is get yourself a gift for me. And it's like, oh, it's just so heart-wrenching. And, you see it in the film, and because you know it from the text, like, that bundle of white roses, like, hits. But then you're like, wait, why are there white roses?
Yeah.
Did he have his birthday? Am I missing something? Like, why are these here right now?
That's one where brevity maybe gets... the movie maybe misses a little something due to its brevity. I was going to say the same thing about the fact that she originally was standing outside his apartment night after night for a long time before she ever first encountered him, and she says that in the narration in the movie. I don't know that you really feel that. It's like the first time we see her outside his apartment, he turns around and says hello. So there is some condensing of narrative information that I think sometimes, if you've read the text, I think you find yourself longing for. If you hadn't read the text, I don't think you'd even notice, though.
Right, but wouldn't you just love, like, a 40-second dissolve of just multiple nights and dusks of her just standing there staring up at that lit window?
Yeah, he's not afraid of that kind of montage. We get one at the end. That might help to suggest the endurance of her interest for sure.
Anything else? Should we go to favorite scenes?
Let's do it. Anything come to mind?
How dare you? So I've always had this favorite scene, and it is the scene that this film is known for. It is the train sequence in which they are simultaneously falling into a romantic engagement of fawning over each other in this kind of magical romanticism of the night while they're on a train ride moving nowhere with a painted screen behind them showing the Alps or wherever else they'd like to go. It's a gorgeously shot sequence, but it's also just romantically swooning. It conveys the emotionality of these characters completely, and their performances within the frame are that of adoration toward one another, and this meagerness, but this overexcitement, it's almost childlike infatuation. It comes together flawlessly.
Good scene. I might go with a scene where we see her in her youth, kind of sneaking out of her room while her mom's still in the living room just to go out to the hallway and try to listen to him playing the piano. This is well before she had seen him for the first time, I believe. partly just because of the music he's playing. Oh my goodness, it's so beautiful. And she opens up a little window and you see like a little wind kind of like rustle her hair. And there are some nice like reflections in this movie and kind of mirror shots. And this one feels even
expressionism.
Yeah, this one feels even more kind of offhanded, where she's kind of just bathing in this music for a second and wondering what's on the other side of the wall, and her face is kind of reflected in that window right there. Love it. Great stuff.
So now I'm going to caveat, and I'm going to say one of the best choices by Max Ophüls within this film is the repetition of the stairwell shot. She is taken, or she finds out that she's going to move, and she wants to go confront Stefan as this 12-year-old girl, and she goes back into the apartment house to wait, and he comes home with a girl, and she goes all the way up the stairs past his apartment, and we don't see her face, we see the back of her. It's kind of a third-person perspective thing, and the camera does like the sideways dolly pan to where Stefan's hallway to his apartment is. And he's coming up with this woman, and she's crushed. The effect of the camera turning like that and her placement within the frame gives it this dizzying, like just absolutely overwhelmed with sadness and pain effect for her, and just her in the frame while the rest of the frame is not doing that. It's very, very interesting. He repeats that same exact shot later when she is going up to the apartment with Stefan. It's like track for track, same exact shot, same exact technique, same exact camera placement and timing. It's just this flawless repetition to show that she was upset at these horrors going up into his room, and then she became another one of those nameless women who goes there. And just that repetition, I think, is one of the genius things that Ophüls did within the film.
Yeah, I mean, you have that repeated. The beginning itself is obviously kind of a repetition in how we circle back to where we began. The train station, we first see her leave Stefan for 2 weeks and then leave her son Stefan for 2 weeks. The repetition is quite satisfying.
It's fantastic. That is Letter from an Unknown Woman.
Until next time, where we'll talk about Mirror. And that's another one in the can.
Now you don't.